Okay, so thank you for joining this week's class hosted by Westminster Justice Work. We're pleased to welcome Dr. Greg Jones and Rabbi Douglas Krantz to facilitate a discussion on the crisis in Jerusalem. Once again, many people are dying in the city that is a special holy place for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Dr. Jones and his good friend, Rabbi Douglas Krantz, will share how they see the situation, and we will all have a chance to discuss it. Dr. Jones, of course, is the pastor of our church. He has spent considerable time in Israel and in Palestine, leading pilgrimages and traveling there with his wife during his first sabbatical. Noah and Greg have been to Israel, Palestine 4 times. Rabbi Douglas E. Krantz is the founding rabbi of Congregation B'nai Israel in Armonk, New York. Throughout his life, he has promoted interfaith relationships and focused on social justice issues by promoting civil rights and peace in both the US and Israel. In 1970, Rabbi Krantz spent his first year in study at the Hebrew Union College Biblical and Archaeological School in Jerusalem. Over the years, he has made numerous trips to Israel and continues a 30-year friendship with a Palestinian family who lives in Gaza. Rabbi Krantz helped to form J Street and serves on its Rabbinic Advisory Council. He chairs the Delaware chapter of J Street, where he and Dr. Jones promote peace and justice for Israelis and Palestinians. I'll now turn it over to Dr. Jones and Rabbi Krantz.
Thank you so much, Lynn. That was a nice introduction. And I just want to add also that Westminster folks, you may remember that Douglas has joined us in worship, actually several times, but he's been in worship leadership at least a couple of times. When we celebrated my 40th year in ministry, Douglas was there. And then on another occasion, he preached in one of our worship services. And he claims that he and Joan just love to come to Christmas Eve.
We do. We do. We do.
Yeah.
Wonderful holiday. And it's really beautifully done at Westminster. And we haven't gone that many places when I was working in New York. We just didn't go very often for a whole variety of reasons. But anyway, it's great to be here with all of you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Greg.
Really glad you joined us, Douglas. Yeah, we feel like we got a real blessing after Douglas retired. He and Joan retired from New York here to Delaware, and all of a sudden he was here with us, and we've been able to form a relationship, a good friendship, and had lots of good discussions together and done a lot of good work together as well. So
I think so too. Yeah.
Yeah. Douglas and Joan, you're a blessing. Really appreciate it.
Well, we feel the same way about you and Camilla. Exactly.
I'd like to go ahead and just begin with a word of prayer, if we could.
Sure.
Eternal God, from whom we come, in whom we live and move and have our being, and to whom we go, we remember that we are part of the whole human family, and we all share your amazing blue planet that we call home. You've given us the gift of life and beckoned us to live together in peace. But we so often brush aside your dream for the world. You give us basic commandments by which we are to live our lives, to worship only you, to honor our parents, to not steal, kill, or covet. Yet too often we ignore your commands and pursue the gods of domination and greed. Grant us the necessary strength to overcome the lure of things that appeal in the short run, such as power, but in the long run, destroy us. We will be known by our words and our actions. May we be known as people of justice and pursuers of peace. Amen.
Amen.
So Douglas and I are going to share some of our perspectives on what's currently happening, what's prompted this current round of violence, why Americans should care, the current political situation, and then open it up to your questions. And I've told Douglas that I'm going to make some opening remarks, but he's welcome to interrupt me at any point. So what's happening today? Here's kind of just the facts and figures, I think, of what's going on right now. According to the New York Times this morning, Israeli attacks on Gaza have killed at least 230 Palestinians, including 65 children, and close to 2,000 have been wounded. Hamas rockets have been fired into Tel Aviv and nearby Israeli towns. They've killed 10 Israelis, including 2 children, and 2 foreign workers from Thailand. Protests have spread beyond just Gaza and Jerusalem to other cities as well. There have been a number of protests in the West Bank, and security forces have killed 12 Palestinians in the West Bank. In 2014, when war broke out like this between Palestinians and Israelis, it took 3 months almost, I think 2 months, 2 months to finally get to a ceasefire. But Douglas just informed me as he came on that just a couple of hours ago, there has been a ceasefire. Of course, our prayers is that it holds.
Right.
Douglas, anything you want to add to that piece of it?
Yeah, I was thinking about this this afternoon with the ceasefire, and something came to my mind, a memory that I hadn't really thought about in a while. I moved from the University of California, Berkeley in 1970 when I graduated college. I moved to Jerusalem, and I moved from what was the center of the anti-war movement for sure in this country, certainly the most liberal community. And I moved to Israel, which was then very much a second world country. There were no phones, there were no private cars, there were just public transportation via bus. And I moved from the center of the anti-war movement to an armed camp. Mm-hmm. And I have memories. I can still relive some of the feelings of seeing all of that armament carried so casually by soldiers in the streets and by policemen. And what I want to say to all of you to begin this is that with Zionism, and really in the post-Holocaust era, but a little bit before, we experienced something that has been uncommon in terms of Jewish awareness. And that is that for large segments of the world Jewish community, the consciousness of Jews has been militarized by at first by the Holocaust, and then by the state of Israel, which saw itself as the armed camp to protect Jews from anybody trying to destroy them again. And what I want to say to you is I understand the answer, I understand the response, and I also understand what a mistake it was. And I've said this with Greg before, since December of 1973, I've been working for the two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict without success. It has been a failure. The peace camp has not succeeded on either side. But in some ways, all of religion, I speak better from a Jewish perspective, let me put it this way, large parts of the Jewish religion are about failure. Our most holy day is the Day of Atonement. It's about moral and intellectual and human failure. That's when Jews come to sanctuaries in uncommon numbers. So I share that just some kind, there's a tragedy here that I'm still talking about after 50 years of being involved in working for a better solution. So you're talking to one of the world's great failures, a person who's failed.
No, we are talking to someone who persists and who is determined and who can endure.
Without results of significance, but yes, and I keep working. But I think it's important to say that. And I want to say another word about this. the militarization of human consciousness is always a tragedy. And we have to be really careful about that. And I think that I understand how it happened. I understand the response, and I understand how it hasn't brought Israel what it really wanted, which was security. And security doesn't come with a weapon. Security comes with a relationship.
That is well put. Very well put. Yeah.
That's my introduction.
Thanks, Douglas. One of the questions that has popped up from several people who've just emailed me or called me or whatever, they've been trying to understand what sort of prompted the current round of violence. And I'd like to share my perspective on that. And Douglas, I'd like you to comment on that.
Sure, please.
Yeah. So what prompted the current round? My short answer is the occupation. But here's how I understand the fuse that lit the current violence. In late April, Jewish extremists were marching through Palestinian neighborhoods shouting "Death to Arabs." And this was at a time of rising tensions because in East Jerusalem, which is predominantly Palestinian, Jewish settlers have been trying to seize their homes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And they're working through the courts to try to seize these homes, and a decision was supposed to be made by May the 10th. So there were these rising tensions already. And during that time, a video went viral showing a Palestinian woman saying to an Israeli settler, "You're trying to steal my home." And he replies, "If I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it." And if you haven't seen that video, you can just Google "If I don't steal your home," and you'll see that clip. So that went viral. This is, of course, also at the time of the holy month of Ramadan for Muslims. And they gathered on the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, and many were at the mosque worshiping, and something prompted a violent response by the Israeli police force, who fired tear gas and rubber bullets, and many were injured. So all of these things were happening, and hundreds of Palestinians were injured at that time. The Al-Aqsa Mosque compound is where the Dome of the Rock is as well. Some of you might be more familiar with the Dome of the Rock. And that area is the third holiest religious site for Muslims. That's after Mecca and Medina. So it's a really important place, and it overshadows the Western Wall, which is the holiest site for Jews.
Right.
So it's a place that's oftentimes tense.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I want to share something. You know, I want to say that this is not about angels and devils on both sides. I want to be really clear about that. And I want to say that I want to remind everybody that in 1973, on the Jewish Day of Atonement, when Jews are in synagogue in huge numbers, and when nobody eats all day, the Egyptian armies attacked Israel in the 1973 war. So because some military leaders think that there's an advantage to attacking people when they're fasting. I mean, and and that's what I mean about the militarization. It has taken place on both sides, and one uses the bad pretext of the other to do the same thing. And it's how this difficulty feeds on itself. And what it does is it pushes away reason and moderation, and a reminder that, as bad as wars are, there were some rules from time to time, you know. And so that's and one of the questions, it's also a question that I can't really answer, is what is appropriate self-defense in this world? All right. And I don't own guns. I have knives in the kitchen to cut the vegetables and the meat, but I don't have weapons. But people feel insecure and they buy weapons in huge numbers. And in our country, you can buy an AK-47 and endless munitions because people have had their consciousness militarized in some way. And I view that as a failure common to many of what I call liberal religionist people. We have not been able to convince people about how to feel safe and how to find emotional security. So I want to say that I see this problem as both an Israeli, Palestinian, Arab problem, but I also see it as a human problem.
Yep, very good. Thank you. So, why should Americans even care about what's going on? I've come up with several reasons why I think we should care. First off, it's a humanitarian concern. Whenever people suffer, and it's not an American value to deny people human rights. And for Christians, Jesus calls on us to care for people who suffer and to liberate the oppressed. In the Gospel of Luke, when Jesus preaches his first sermon, he borrows from the prophet Isaiah. And he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to bring good news to the poor, to open the eyes of the blind, and to let the oppressed go free." So I think one reason is because of our humanitarian concern for people. Secondly, I think we should care because, unfortunately, everybody on this screen, we are supporting the Israeli military if you're paying your taxes.
Yep.
We give Israel $3.8 billion a year that they can spend on their military, and we don't put any strings on that at all. In fact, there are arguments about why our politicians don't require some sort of restrictions on that aid. Third, we should care because we want Israel to be a home for the three Abrahamic faiths. But the occupation undermines Israel's security. Israel's standing in the world would be greatly enhanced if it were not an occupying power. And so this, in my mind, one of the main reasons I come to this issue is because I want Israel to do well and to look good in the eyes of the world and to play its role as a leading nation. Fourth, we should care because if the policies of the Israeli government are successful in pushing out all the Palestinians, then we'll reach the day when there are no more Christians in the land where Jesus walked and where Christians have been for 2,000 years, where it all started for us. Just a few decades ago, 20% of the population was Christian. Today, it's 2%. And that's very important to me. And I imagine some people on here, and if you've ever been to the Holy Land, I know you've seen some of the most important sites in the world.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave. Go ahead.
Last one.
Sure.
Gaza is a humanitarian disaster. 17 hospitals and dozens of schools have been damaged. Sewage is running in the streets. People are living in tents. 72,000 Gazans have been forced from their homes. Douglas, what have I missed?
Well, nothing. but I have some thoughts to share about what you said. I don't disagree with anything that you said. Let me start with Gaza. as I haven't been to Gaza now for 3 years. And the last time I went, it was with UN, and it was very dicey, and it wasn't a comfortable place to be. My wife and I have been very friendly with an extended family in Gaza now for 30 years. When we visited Gaza for the first time in 1991 or 1990, Edward Said was a professor at Columbia and a Palestinian, and he helped me arrange to meet the Palestinian leadership in Jerusalem. And the head of the Palestinian community in Jerusalem at the time, Faisal Husseini, sent us to Gaza. And we got to Gaza and we were totally lost. We were looking for someone named Wafik, which is a very common Arabic name. And so my wife and I wandered into a pharmacy because we thought he might speak English. And he called the guy and he came to get us. And we took a picture of the pharmacist, and we had been friendly with his family since that date. And we've corresponded and we stayed with them, and we've spoken to them. When the bombing starts, we call most, often. And the other day we were on a call, and one of the things we learned from our friends is that the bombing has been uncommonly harsh compared to what they've experienced in the past, that this has been a ratcheting up of violence. And it's obviously a failed doctrine. The doctrine is that if you hit me with one rocket, I'm going to hit you with 10 missiles, kind of stupid math that gets played. But when you're talking to people when you stayed in their home and they're your friends, and one of the members of the family was in our home in New York, and when you know their children, and when you're really quite close to them, and they have to hang up because the jets are coming, and you say goodbye, you don't know if you're really saying goodbye forever. And it's terrifying. The other thing to tell you is I was once in Gaza for an engagement party of a member of the family that I'm talking about, and there was a suicide bombing in Tel Aviv. And so the question is, what do I do? Do I get in a car and race to the border because the reprisals coming? And I decided to stay. And I was in Gaza when the gunships came ashore, and it was terrifying. And it's been the same game, of back and forth for years. And I tell people that it's the most significant failure of my career. I've been working on this since 1973. So I think we have to keep working.
And don't you think the mood in this country is changing?
Well, it's changing in two directions. I think that the peace camp in the American Jewish community, through the work of J Street, which I've been privileged to be a part of, has really had a positive effect on Capitol Hill. I think that I also think evangelical Christians have a strong tendency to support the right-wing governments of Israel. Mm-hmm. And I think that their influence on the Netanyahu government is more significant than the influence of the American Jewish community, or even J Street or AIPAC. And I don't know. I mean, I remember when Menachem Begin reached out to evangelical Christians. I just had no idea how successful that was going to be.
Douglas, since you mentioned it, maybe you could just give a brief explanation of the differences between AIPAC and J Street.
Sure. AIPAC is the American Israel something, I can't remember, a Public Affairs Committee. And it was known as, that's the Jewish lobby. And in my career, which was all in New York, because I was working on these causes, AIPAC people really went after the rabbis like me. There were fortunately enough of us, and many rabbis lost their jobs. I was fortunate I did not.
And that's because you were too sympathetic to the Palestinian cause.
Oh, I've been called, yeah, when people called me an Arab lover, I told them they were right. And I told them, of course I love Arabs. I'm a rabbi. I also love Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Come on. You know, I mean, what did they think I was, a rabbi who hated somebody? You know, where's love your neighbors yourself? Come on. You know, and so, but look, well, I don't know if I'll say it this way. When I was speaking one year during one of our high holy days, someone threw down their prayer book and used some expletives and announced in a loud voice that I didn't hear because I was talking, I quit. And people quit every year. I was lucky, you know, and look, our American community is divided in a host of ways. I don't know the Christian community. I don't know your specific church community, but I suspect there are some divisions there over theology and other matters. The question really isn't whether we're divided. It's how do we deal with our divides? And I've always felt that we don't deal with our divides with guns, ever. It only makes things worse.
It only makes things worse. You're right.
And that's where the militarization of consciousness has so destroyed both sides, both the suicide bombers, you know, and the people who respond to a slingshot with a machine gun.
Yeah. Could you share a little bit about how you see the political situation in Israel? And then after that, I'd like to talk a little bit about the shift in the political situation in the United States because of the influence of J Street, there being two games in town rather than just one game in town.
Yeah, I love that one too. The political shift in Israel has been significant. In 1992 or 94, I'm sorry, I get the years mixed up. I was never good at numbers. But when the Rabin government came into power with the Meretz Party and Labor forming a government, there was a huge peace camp in Israel. And I was in the most fortunate position to be president and chairman of the board of Meretz USA. So I was very involved with that particular government. And I was convinced that we were going to be able to create a peace. And it failed for a variety of reasons. All right, it failed because the Camp David summit wasn't carefully arranged. It failed because we didn't have leaders with the tenacity of Jimmy Carter. All right, we just didn't have the same level of insistence that we had with Jimmy Carter. And we had Chairman Arafat, who was not really honest. And I sat with him two or three times alone. I have to look, just the two of us. And then 3 or 4 other times with Meretz delegations who went to visit him in Gaza. We were not friends, but we talked. And I remember what happened was that there was an incident where he was smuggling missiles into Israel. And I had to stand up before the congregation and apologize. I'd been lied to. And what I wish almost more than anything else is that the Palestinian people had good and decent leadership. As I wish now that the Israeli community had decent leadership. Netanyahu is not a decent man. All right, he's just not. And decency is a very important quality. And we don't need one decent person, we need two. And we don't have them. You know, we just don't have them. I mean, I put a lot on the line in some ways, and I'm glad I did for the Palestinian leadership. I thought we needed to talk to them. I still think we do, but that hasn't worked out as well as I hoped either.
I think you're exactly right that we need good leadership on both sides, and both sides do not, neither side is a good leader.
Not at this moment. Not at this moment. No, a matter of fact, both sides have politically corrupt leaders. I mean, Netanyahu is a criminal. A criminal. And I don't think Abbas is very different. My suspicion is that some of these people have bank accounts abroad.
Yeah.
So it's bleak for the moment.
It is bleak for the moment right now.
But politically, but I want to say something. Politically, it's bleak. But the human potential and capital is there. The Palestinians are wonderful and warm and spectacularly well educated, and so are most Israelis.
Douglas, maybe we could talk a little bit about what I see as a shift in this country as far as I read recently where Nicholas Kristof was saying that we now are at a stage where American politicians can say things that they couldn't say 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think J Street has influenced that, and young Israeli, young people, Americans, have also influenced that. And I think there's been some sort of cross-pollination with Black Lives Matter and understanding the Palestinian.
All of that's true. Let me say a word about J Street. J Street has a gifted leader in Jeremy Ben-Ami, beyond my wildest dreams. He's the gift that keeps on giving in a way that is abundant and fantastic. There were, I think, 15 of us on the phone calls that launched J Street. The first leadership meeting, we had 35. And now we have a huge PAC, and we have mounted a challenge against AIPAC that is significant. AIPAC is much larger, still more formidable, but we have made huge inroads into the Democratic Party, which is a mistake in some ways, because our inroads are in the Democratic Party and AIPACs are in the Republican Party. And suddenly Israel is now, the Democrats see it one way and the Republicans see it the other way. That's not really great for bringing about a deal that's bipartisan. It's become partisan, which it never was before. And that's in part our fault on the left, but or the fault of the peace camp, if you want to fault the peace camp. But we did make it partisan. And I'm hoping we're going to keep gaining in numbers on our side of the ledger, but there's no guarantee of that. It's a bit of a risk. So, you know, I want to say something else, though, that I think is really good. We've been able to do some things that are good, that were never done before. And we have Representative Betty McCollum has a bill coming before Congress to prevent the Israelis from, I don't know how they're going to do this, because I don't know how any of this works, but they're trying to prevent the Israelis from using any American dollars for nefarious purposes, period. And I hope that works. I hope it does.
And the fact that a bill like that does exist in Congress these days, and there are people signing on, is another sign that things have shifted in a certain extent.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Also, I'd like to mention the fact that J Street brought Admiral Ari Ayon to Westminster a few years ago and helped push the Iran deal. And I think had a very strong influence on Senator Coons.
Particular. Yeah. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
he was
And
a holdout.
yeah. Yeah. We did support and advocated and did a lot of political work for the Iran deal. And again, this was J Street versus AIPAC. And this was our first big victory. Yeah.
Really was. I'm thinking with the time as it is that we probably better pause and we need to open up the floor and see what sort of questions people have.
Sure.
Lynn, I don't know if you want to facilitate this or if you want me to try to or what.
Yeah, I think if people can either use the hand raise function or just physically put your hand up so we can see it. Greg, you can go ahead and call on folks is fine.
Okay, I see Dave has a hand up. So Dave McBride, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, and I wanted to make a comment as a threshold matter. Is of all the things that's been said tonight, Douglas said to me one of the most crucial things that I agree with, and that is there are no devils or angels on either side of this dispute. I think both sides have tremendous claims to being right, and both sides have tremendous criticisms that can be made of them, both morally and politically. Having said that, I got a question for Greg and a question for Douglas, if I could. My question for Greg is, you said that the occupation, at the very basic level, the occupation is the problem. And I think that's largely true. My question, though, is, I'm not aware of any occasion when the Palestinians or Arabs have ever offered Israel a deal by which they could end the occupation. Arafat walked away from what was probably the greatest deal he'd ever get in 1999 when Clinton negotiated literally, I think, a return of almost the entire West Bank in return, and what land Israel was going to keep in the West Bank would be offset by land in Israel, and Arafat walked away from it. And the one occasion where Israel has abandoned the occupation was Gaza, and the result of that is Gaza's been turned into an armed camp that, in this most recent round, fired 4,000 missiles at Israeli cities.
Well, I think you'd also want to keep in mind that they are also just locked there and not allowed to leave Gaza either.
Well, but they're locked there because Hamas was elected to lead Gaza. And I understand why I think originally Hamas was elected. They provided social services to the Gaza community that Arafat's group was incapable because they were so corrupt of doing. Now Hamas, I think Hamas is as responsible as Israel is for the conditions in Gaza right now. But when has Israel ever been offered an opportunity to end the occupation? So that's my question.
Yeah, you got to keep in mind that Israel is the power who is in control. They are the ones who are occupying. They're the ones who are calling all the shots.
But they only occupied because they were attacked, and in the process of winning that war, they took that land. I mean, I just don't understand. What is it that, again, the only occasion when Israel has given up the occupation was Gaza. But let
me respond about Gaza, Dave. First of all, there's a difference between the PLO and Hamas. Hamas haven't as individuals opened huge bank accounts in international capitals. They are not corrupt in that sense, okay? They are a little fanatic, but they're not corrupt in that sense. That's one thing. Secondly, they're not exactly locked into Gaza, meaning I've gotten into Gaza during Hamas's rule to visit the family that I I love so much and that we still talk to. And they can get in and out through Egypt as well. And I've also gone that way over the years, but not since Hamas has taken over. I haven't come in through Egypt. I will tell you that the problem is that everybody has such good excuses. You know, in other words, Hamas gave the Israel right wing an open invitation to bomb them by sending missiles. And you know, and I keep going back to, this isn't angels against devils. All right. There were huge underground tunnels that had been built by the Palestinians in Gaza. They're building tunnels for Hamas soldiers to get into Israel. All right. And that's why I started with the militarization of consciousness. Both sides are feeding this voracious, destructive machine. And frankly, I've tried my entire career to slow that down, and it's gotten worse.
And my question for you, Douglas, was, is there any security reason for Israel? It seems to me the worst thing that Israel has done is deprive Palestinians in the occupied territories and in Israel proper, where they actually are citizens of Israel, of civil liberties. And my recollection is when that began, after the second intifada, that there were security reasons given for much of that.
I want to say something, that security is an abused phenomenon. All right. There is no such thing as security, even inside a secure prison in the United States. Prisoners are not secure. They're attacked all the time. You can't have security with bars. The only way you have security is with human relationships of trust. That gives you security.
Yeah.
I mean, it starts with loving your neighbor as yourself. All right. You got to do that. That's your security. It's not in any other form. It's in relationships. All right. And dependency. And what you have also in Israel now is you don't just have the Israeli army. When I talk about the militarization of consciousness, 2 years ago, I went to Hebron with a friend of mine who was a former soldier, and he's the leader of a group called Combatants for Peace. And we went to Hebron, and I hadn't been there, and there were 3 or 4 of us. I was with a journalist, and there were 3 of us, or 4 of us, I can't remember. And we were suddenly surrounded by heavily armed settlers. I mean, I wasn't the least bit concerned. They weren't going to shoot an American rabbi, not in the West Bank. They just weren't. But they were trying to intimidate us. So what you have is you have in Israel an army, and then you have armed settlers throughout the land. I mean, it's a very, very dangerous situation.
And the army is one of the strongest armies in the world. It's a nuclear
Absolutely.
power.
Yeah.
Mary?
Of course, we're all terribly disturbed by the current events. What recommendations do you have for actions we should take as private citizens?
Well, I really think we can influence our representatives.
Absolutely.
And Delaware is a unique spot. With us being so small, we know these folks and we can influence them. Senator Carper just signed on a bill calling for the president to push hard for a ceasefire a couple of days ago. But for some reason, Senator Coons didn't. And these are the kind of situations where we can influence people. And I think Senator Coons could be very much influenced if enough people would contact the office, send a letter, call them on the phone.
And to his credit, I will say one thing about Senator Coons. J Street has made subtle inroads with Senator Coons. And there was a very tough meeting with the president and the chairman of the board of J Street and my wife and me and Senator Coons. And he took the AIPAC language off of his website. The AIPAC language was, I support the two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, negotiated directly between the parties, without intermediaries, which is to say a recipe for failure. And he took that off and he supported House Resolution 234, completely put himself in the two-state solution camp. And I give him credit for that. And I want to be clear. He's, you know, I was the kind of rabbi I wanted to be. Reverend Jones is the kind of minister he wants to be. And Chris Coons has a right to be the senator he wants to be, especially because he moved away from one camp closer to mine.
Let's just keep pushing.
Yeah, that's right. Together. And you're bigger. You can take on the load.
I think we also have to keep asking our representatives to do something about the Israeli occupation, because until that changes, I just don't see that we're ever going to have peace, and the people who live there are ever going to have peace.
Yeah, I mean, the occupation is clearly pernicious, and it's also something else. It's self-destructive. And here's what I mean by self-destructive. If I take away something that belongs to my neighbor and claim it as my own, all right, I lose a part of my humanity. That's not a winning way to do things. So, and I'll go back to Hebron, where I was a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, whenever it was. I remember Hebron from 1970. I had great memories of being there. And one other time with my wife in 1992, I think. The settler movement has stolen the marketplace. And they have taken the doors that open to the streets where the vendors had their shops for thousands of years, and they welded those iron doors shut, and they open now into an illegal settlement. Now, what does that do to a person's character? What does that make? How would you like to raise your children in that environment? What kind of children are they going to be? You know, they tried to intimidate me. I've just felt sorry for them. I see tragedy written all over that.
Thank you, Douglas. The other thing I think that we should push our politicians on is to call for an end of settlements.
Not just an end, we need to call for the dismantlement of the settlements.
Right, right.
The settlement enterprise is illegal and immoral and clearly not, it has nothing to do with that wonderful Hebrew phrase, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," you shall love your neighbor as yourself.
If you love them, you don't take their land away from them, right?
Where is Lisa Blunt Rochester's position on all this?
She seems to be AWOL.
Well, I'm not sure quite what that means, but she has some, that's a condition. I want to talk about the fact that she has taken money from our PAC and agreed to support all of the J Street positions. The rest of the part, I I'm going to let Reverend Jones handle that part diplomatically as he can. He's better than I am at this.
Yeah, I'm afraid she's just been way too timid.
She's taken the right positions.
But she's not, but she doesn't seem to have any passion or any force. And that's my concern, especially because it should be so obvious that the Palestinian cause is so similar to the African-American cause as far as not having the human.
More, I want to add something to that. It's more similar than you're stating. And I want to be really clear about this. I think we talked about it with recently, but one of the things that was very clear to me when I moved to Israel was that there was a huge divide between the white European Jews and the dark-skinned Sephardic Jews. They were clearly second-class citizens and still are. One of my closest friends, a driver and somebody I've known for years and years and years, and spent hours with, and a man I adore. 3 years ago, we were driving to Jerusalem, and his car was stopped because he's got dark skin. And he felt so humiliated in front of me. And he was pleading with these soldiers, Ani rak ben adam. And he could hardly get the words out. He was, I'm just a regular guy, over and over and over again. And if that's how they treat Jews, all right, imagine if you're an Arab. What I want to say is that Jews are human beings, and many human beings, including Jews, can be and are racists. Racism is not it. It's a part of this conflict. It's a part of the way we see the world. You know, I mean, it's it's what a friend of mine here in Delaware calls driving while black. It's a different experience. And so there's white privilege in Israel too, and other places in the world.
Douglas, thank you for sharing that, and thank you for everything you've shared. I want to respect people's time.
Yep.
We've filled the hour, but I've really appreciated all your comments, Douglas. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Roger had his hand up throughout, so could we do one more question?
Yep. Sorry, Roger, didn't see it.
I wonder, are both sides using population increase as a weapon of sorts? I mean, we talk about a constant need for new settlements. Is that a population increase, or are Jews coming into, more Jews coming into Israel now from other parts of the world?
Yes, I mean, they're recruited to come in. They're
recruited to come in.
Yeah. And I don't know if it's still going on, Douglas, but I know at one point they would pay Jews from other countries to come in and live in the settlements.
They would, and not just the settlements, even before the settlements, in the early state days too. There were incentives to come because they wanted to increase the population. A part of the core of Zionism was the idea of the return to the land. I'm sorry, I'm going to go over time just a moment. And the idea, though, was messianic. You know, the messianic view of Judaism, and the view of Judaism is that the Messiah has not yet come, but a part of the coming of the Messiah was going to be the ingathering of the Jews who were exiled from the land by the Romans. So the ingathering of the exile, Zionism built on that old idea and translated it a bit to build the state. It's not an exactly religious idea, but it has its roots in that old hope of the return to Zion, from which Jews were exiled. Jews don't live around the world voluntarily. I mean, that didn't happen necessarily voluntarily. That happened when they were expelled, except for a small handful that stayed, very few, hundreds over the years. So.
Well,
Thank you, Douglas.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing your perspectives with us. I think we've all learned a lot this evening, so thank you Thank you both.
I
Well,
really
thank you, and thank
appreciate
you.
everybody hanging in with us tonight.
Thank you. And thank you, Reverend Jones, for your friendship.
Thanks, Douglas. Great to see you.
Good
We'll
to
get
see you
together
too.
soon.
Thank you so much.
Take
Thanks,
care.
everyone.
Good day, everyone.